Burnout, a term we are familiar with, occasionally use, albeit casually. But what does burnout actually mean? Is it different from compassion fatigue? How does it affect the profession? And can it be prevented? Now, to answer these questions, I'm delighted to be joined by two remarkable colleagues, Carolyne Crowe and Ivan Zak. Carolyne, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
Yeah, thank you very much, Aubrey, for inviting me on. So I'm Carolyne Crowe. I'm a vet and an equine vet by trade. So I qualified from London and the RVC in 2002, then went into equine practice for 12 years. Loved what I did, but I got more interested in us as people and why we do what we do. So it was about 8 years ago, I decided to look at what else was around and how else I could use my skills. And as I said, I really enjoyed the people part, which I know is probably some of the challenges for others within the profession, if they don't enjoy the people part, but I really enjoyed the people part. So I trained as a personal performance coach and went on and did diplomas in stress management, in well-being. I went on and did a master's degree in workplace health and well-being. So workplace, and that's basically workplace stress. And workplace stress is something that I really love. Helping people overcome workplace stress is what I actually really love. So I set my own business up. And then in 2017, I joined up with the Veterinary Defence Society. So Veterinary Defence Society are professional indemnity insurers in the UK. And I set up the BDS training segment of our insurance company. So I'm now head of training at the BDS. And we sit in a very privileged position. I really do believe we're in a privileged position within the profession to understand why we make a mistake as veterinary professionals. And what we really understand is the majority of the causes behind mistakes and errors and the situations we find ourselves in are rarely due to a real lack of clinical knowledge, but it's how we implement that, how we communicate it. So it's all sort of the human factors around how we are and do we do our job. So that's what we now do within the VDS training team, is we look at the non-clinical factors and the non-clinical training to equip individuals to get the best out of themselves, to work well as a team, and to thrive at work. Because fundamentally, when we break it all down, we've only got one life, and how can we get the most out of that? And that's what I'm really passionate about, helping people develop personally and professionally, get the most out of what they do and what they love as well.
Well, Carolyne, because you didn't say it, I will. If I'm not mistaken, it's an award-winning coach, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I was honoured to get the 2015 Life Coach of the Year, and then I had my fellowship from the Royal College last year. My contribution to the profession. So
amazing. As I said, this is the Find Remarkable podcast, and moving next to another remarkable colleague, and that's Ivan. Ivan, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us what it is that you do?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me here, Aubrey. So Ivan Zak, a vet by trade as well. Graduated in 2006 from Atlantic Vet College, practiced veterinary medicine for about 12 years as an ER vet, as well as a lot of relief work, and burned out along the way. So, which happens to a lot of us. So that's where the topic came sort of close to heart to me. And then recovered from that, continued to practice, but then slowly transitioned into software in the veterinary domain, became passionate about the workflows and the how to improve operational efficiency, and created SmartFlow, which I was the founder of. And then we exited to IDEX, where I became a general manager of the software division for a short period of time. And then from there, or in parallel, I decided to focus a little more on business. So I went and did the MBA in International Healthcare Management, where as a dissertation topic, I researched the burnout levels, at least in the veterinary domain. And I was looking for methodology in management to sort of influence or improve the situation with burnout and suicide, which kind of became my new business idea. And it's a Veterinary Integration Solutions, which I'm the founder and the CEO of. And we are designing a methodology and the software that will help that will help consolidators to manage the organizations, preserving the experience of the staff as they're going through acquisitions and consolidation.
So by consolidators, you mean the bigger corporates?
Correct. Yeah. The groups, okay. Some of them don't like the word consolidator. Some of them don't like the word groups. It could be a franchise. It could be de novo models. It could be acquisitions model. Anybody who accumulates, north of 10 hospitals, I think, is a consolidator, but they all like to call themselves differently. But it's basically joining practices to build a one group that is centrally managed and optimizing the efficiencies.
Right. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining me. Welcome to the GuavaVet Find Remarkable vlog. This is episode 7. And Ivan, I'm going to start with you. So you've done the research. Would you mind telling us how you define burnout? And maybe briefly tell us about your research and your findings.
Yeah, so I mean, there's different definitions of burnout, but essentially it's the emotional exhaustion with depersonalization from clients and pets when the cynicism develops and low sense of professional accomplishment. And it usually translates into the personal life of the individual, which affects them in all areas of life, and unfortunately, in some instances, leads to dark places. And some of them, in our profession, which is known as a high rate of suicide. So the study that we did, the research portion of the dissertation, I heard a lot about the burnout and I had the personal experience with it, but I was just wondering, is this statistically proven that we're actually burned out more than others? And are we at all, or is it like shark attacks that, one shark attacks someone and everybody hears about it? So we collected, it was an anonymized survey that we deployed through social media, through certain marketing tools, and we collected almost 1,500 respondents, which I think everybody who participated from listeners. And we asked them where were they practicing, so whether they were academia, whether they were practicing vets, whether they were relief work, and then we asked them whether they were in the consolidated practices or groups, or they were privately owned organizations. And then we asked them also what positions they take inside of the hospital. So whether they're a technician or the nurse, or the veterinarian or manager or support staff. So that's sort of how we sliced it. And then we came up with sort of 3 or 4 main conclusions. And I could dive into those if you want now, or we can save it for later.
Well, no, I think if you want to go ahead with those conclusions, then I will, once you've done that, I will ask Carolyne to, tell us how this differs, if at all, from compassion fatigue, because it's often sort of, almost used maybe mistakenly, interchangeably. So what were your findings then?
Yeah, so we used the professional fulfillment index that was validated among the healthcare professionals, and it was compared to the previous known BMI index, which is also an instrument of evaluating burnout. So we used that, and so one thing that we did discover is that the industry is burned out. So we confirmed that it's not like a shark attack. It's many of us suffer from that. The finding that I was looking for, actually, I wanted to see if consolidated, or those that were acquired, at burnout more than those that are privately owned, and I didn't find statistically relevant difference. There was slight in the numbers, but when you merge the data, it wasn't that significant. The second finding was, which was surprising to me, is that the younger veterinarians are more prone to burnout. And again, maybe it was the timing. It was June, so there's a lot of bias. It was right after, the COVID. But that was the timing. But the younger veterinarians, 30 and under, they were more burned out. Those that are closer to retirement, the baby boomers sort of generation. So that was the second finding. The third one was that the technicians or nurses are more burned out than veterinarians, which I thought was significant because we pay so much attention to veterinarians. There's so much self-help out there. And then people that do the majority of work, at least in my experience as a relief vet, they were always my main pillar that I could lean on in the hospitals. They're burned out more than veterinarians. So those are the three, I think, most significant findings.
Well, that is truly interesting. I read your white paper, and it is definitely a lot of food for thought there. Now, Carolyne, is burnout different from compassion fatigue? And maybe if you could just help us with what compassion fatigue then is, if that's okay.
Yeah, so compassion fatigue is different. I think it's one of those words, there's quite a lot of misuse of the interchangeable between people use burnout, people use stress and workplace stress, and people use compassion fatigue. And there's certainly with compassion fatigue, it contains elements of burnout, but yes, it is different. I think the key thing with, I'm sure Ivan would say as well, the key thing with burnout, it's an occupational phenomenon. So it's because of the environment that people are in. It's not just an individual issue, it's an environmental issue. Compassion fatigue is also known as secondary traumatization. So it's like the emotional residue or strain of exposure when we're working through suffering from the consequences of traumatic events. So those are either things that we go through ourselves or we see in other people. And compassion fatigue can occur due to just exposure to one situation or as a cumulative trauma too. There are common signs, I suppose, with burnout are things like the emotional exhaustion, the decreased sense of personal accomplishment at work. So like the meaning at work is our input is decreased, mental exhaustion, decreased isolation, decreased interactions with others causing us to isolate, and that can be elements with burnout as well, and depersonalization. The difference, probably the main differences are compassion fatigue tends to be more rapid onset, whilst burnout is often emerges over time. And also if compassion fatigue is spotted early, so it's big if, it can be a faster recovery from compassion fatigue compared to with burnout. But with these things, it's not something that you just sort of wake up and you've got it. There's a chronic clouding of caring. It's often because we care too much. So I think with compassion fatigue, I actually think it probably should call it empathy fatigue. So we're told to be empathetic in our roles, but when we are truly empathetic, it's like we step in and we mirror and match the emotions that we're seeing other people go through, which is why it's also known as secondary traumatization. So if you have somebody going through the primary trauma and you are being truly empathetic to that person or that animal and that situation, when they do functional MRIs on our brain, are the same areas of our brain when we're being truly empathetic as those who are going through the primary trauma are stimulated. So we're having the same thing, even though it's not our trauma, we are seeing it and going through it that way. So we are taught to be empathetic. We are taught to care, but sometimes we care too much and our boundaries are blurred, and sort of being a bit of a martyr, we put everybody and everything before we do ourselves. And you'll often hear when people have compassion fatigue, you might hear them say, or you might think yourself, I've given so much, I've just got nothing left to give. I can't do it any longer. There's nothing left of me. And it's because we've actually given too much. So really important to recognize the situations when we're more likely to be empathetically open, and where we need to put those boundaries in so we can stay at a distance where we're still, that we care, of course we care, and we can, but we stay at a distance where we can help that person or that animal through that situation, rather than be so involved in it that we are too involved in it, and it's blurring of those lines, which can very much lead down to compassion fatigue.
Well, it's almost as if there's a pathological empathy developing in some of us. But Ivan, the WHO defines it as work-related stress, a form of work-related stress. However, it is still the feelings of both emotional and energy exhaustion depletion. So, you can sort of understand why these terms of something compassion fatigue we hear about often in our profession, and then burnout as well. Why, people would say, what, isn't this just two different versions or grade of the same emotional work-related condition?
So, to me, the line is grayer because I'm not as educated on the topic as Carolyne. I think that, she defined it really well, which thank you for, Carolyne. I think that to me, the easy sort of tool go to, and maybe it's a phase where do I bring it home from work or do I not? And I think that compassion fatigue is, if I'm correct, it's more associated with when you leave work and the environment, you can dissociate from that over the weekends. And the burnout is kind of, it follows you, and then you get it everywhere, and you sort of don't bounce out of it after, a vacation or something like that. You go back and you dread it. So I think that that's kind of, if I were to simplify it, that's how I understand it. But there's certain triggers at work that bring the burnout, and the classic 6 ones, and you can actually, as management, prevent a lot of them. So 6 of them are the lack of control. So when you don't provide autonomy at work, that leads to burnout, and very common through the acquisition of the hospital, because you were disempowered as the owner of the business, as well as the staff, because the owner changed. The value conflict is a big one. It's basically when your personal values don't align with the values of the organization, and you're constantly running into this conflict. And again, this is why the hypothesis was there about the acquisition, because you were following certain values, you were fit in the practice, you had a certain leader, and then all of a sudden someone comes in with their sign on the wall and says, now your core values are these. Well, the culture doesn't form that way. You really need to either align with them or not. There's no right or wrong culture. There's just different one. If you don't align with that, you can really run into this. Insufficient reward or taken for granted. I felt a lot of that when I worked emergency, because it was definitely overwork, and I was putting all these hours feeling like I'm working so hard, but they don't recognize it. And it was, after hours medical records and things like that. And, some hospitals wouldn't pay for that work, but you have to do it. So you're staying, and instead of focusing on the task at hand, you're just thinking about how you're not paid for things that you're doing. Work overload, I mentioned that already. That's the most common, that people think, oh, you're just working too hard. Unfairness, if in the organization there's favoritism, if there's preferential rights, some people on the same level, and it's a huge HR issue, to get different benefit packages, or there's relationship that shouldn't be there in the organization. And the last one is the breakdown of the community, which often is transpired through lack of feedback, and candor feedback, and no conflict resolution techniques. So if management, and veterinarians are terrible at this, I probably say only about myself, but people skills is not something that we go into the profession, except Carolyne, that's what she liked. But most of us go there because we don't want to talk to people, and you find yourself that you only talk to people, and then that's where if you don't have, and if you start running a business, you have those conflicts that don't know how to resolve. That also can lead to that. So that's what I see that is leading to it. I don't know how that leads to compassion fatigue versus burnout, but I certainly can recognize all of those when I was going through a similar experience.
Yeah.
And so, Carolyne, sorry. I'm sorry for interrupting, but I was thinking, if we, it sounds what you just said there, Ivan, reminded me of the things that we need to be happy at work. And Ivan, you've got your MBA. I define the happiness of MBA as mastery, belonging, and autonomy. And looking at the 6 causes, or the 6 areas, other than not having the necessary resources to be able to do our work. In other words, that resource may be time and so on and so forth. In other words, where you said, being overworked, let's call it that. That's not exactly the correct word. Maybe it's being overworked. So yes, we have that. But then the rest would sort of be, that sense of mastery. I feel that I'm not good at what I do, for some or the other reason. So we lose that. The belonging, which you said there, with regards to unfairness and the interpersonal relationships, that is, that is lacking. And then the autonomy, in other words, being in control, having agency. Carolyne, it seems that, with regards to burnout and what Ivan found is that those are where the problems lie.
Yeah, and that's these similar things in terms of when you look at the research around engagement and motivations of others. So the key 3 things to motivate people are not chocolate, money, and time off or parties, but purpose. So having a purpose. Do people clearly know what their role is? And not to assume it, it's obvious because you're a vet or a nurse or a receptionist or whatever, but do people know what their role is on a day-to-day basis? Has it been reviewed ever or recently? Like at the moment in COVID, what is the purpose of the veterinary team? What is the purpose of the vet today? Because yesterday we had one less vet, tomorrow we might have one less nurse because stuff's happening. So what is the purpose today? Then to have a degree of autonomy in order to be able to do their jobs. You don't have to be in control of the practice, but you need to be able to in control of how you do your role. So managing and meeting expectations, setting boundaries and working clearly, and then that mastering growth. So when we look at engagement and motivation theories, they come into this. This all sort of feeds into very similar sort of crossovers. When we look at workplace stress, we look at we measure, so we have a temperature check that looks at the demands that people are on. So having a very demanding work environment does not lead to burnout. Having a very demanding work environment where there's a low degree of autonomy and lack of support will lead to burnout. So the best environment you can be in is a very demanding environment with a high degree of autonomy and a high degree of support. But remember, support for everybody will look different and autonomy for everybody will look different. So do people know what their roles are? What's the quality of the relationships, which I'm going to talk about, comes into that sort of community. How much change has there been? Which again, probably that transition phase when you're brought out, there's masses of change at the moment. There's masses of change. Yep. How is that communicated? Do people understand it? Are people still on the bus? Because with change, sometimes you need to get off the bus because then you have conflict with your values, and that's not necessarily a bad thing because things move on. But are we harping back to how it used to be and trying to do it? And that's where we're causing friction and conflict. But I think what comes into all of it is looking at psychological safety. Are we having the open, honest conversations to check in with ourselves and check in with our teams to say, where we're at the moment, team, how have we come into work? What have we got on? And not go into deep dives of that each and every day, but actually, what demands have we got? How much control do we feel we've got? Are we having open, honest conversations with those in management and those in team and those as colleagues? Are we supporting each other? Do we even know what that is? Do we even know what the building blocks of a good relationship are? So there's lots of different sort of factors which track out things like when it goes wrong, burnout, compassion fatigue, workplace stress, but there's some real common knitted bits in the middle, and it comes down to people. The job we do and the veterinary practices are, I don't think anything about animals. It's all about people, because we don't work in isolation. We work, even it might just be a really small team, but we work with others, or we work with a client. So there's always more than one. And yet, if we look at what has happened historically, and maybe how we've got to where we are, we control what we are doing, and then it can get frustrating when we have to work with others. So there's lots of reasons why we have a lot of challenges, but there's lots of positives that we can work together as individuals, teams, organizations, and it's around the structure of how we run our days as well a lot.
Well, interestingly, I want to come back to you with your interesting finding that it appeared that the veterinary technicians and nurses were actually more likely to suffer with burnout at work. And I wonder if, one of the main things there would be the appreciation of their role. In other words, feeling valued, feeling rewarded for what they do. I wonder if maybe because we vets are maybe not the best people, sometimes struggling with interpersonal relationships, if that may have any influence on the fact that they feel more burnt out than we do.
Yeah, I think it's it's those all the contributing pieces, and we could really build an environment for the nurses to be appreciated, to be the compensation, there is a ceiling. So, but if you can't work within compensation just because of the professional limitations, but you can work with providing an autonomy, you can work with providing, similar values and articulating them, just like Caroline outlined, and then creating a safe environment psychologically where there's feedback, where there's conflict resolution. I think all of the above, there's no really single one. But in my experience, I relied heavily on the nurses and everybody who I worked with, and in all the initiatives through my career, I was always praising nurses more than anybody else in the facility. And to simplify it, I always was saying, look, I just put signature here. You guys do the work, then you see the appointment. And if it's, in the emergency environment, you could be seeing 6 rooms at the same time. And it's the nurses that make the flow work. And for the most part, you coming in, they've seen, when I graduated, I've known 4 years of books, and then I worked with nurses that worked for 20 years. They would lead me in the direction and help me. So I can't thank enough nurses to run our profession, but then being underappreciated. And I think this is a screaming issue that we need to focus on their well-being as well. I think statistically, I've seen 2 different stats on this. One is that they are more likely to commit suicide, another one that are less. And I don't know which one is right, which one is wrong, but they have exactly the same access to the medications that a lot of veterinarians tend to reach to do that. So we have to be extra careful around them and help them as well.
Caroline, I recently wrote a little blog on my GuavaVet blog page, and I answered the question. I was asked, I asked the question, answered the question, what is it that a veterinarian actually does? And what I suggested we do most of our time, in clinical practice that is we sell. There is no veterinarian that I know that said that they want to be veterinarians because they love people and they love selling.
100% agree, and it comes back down to that values conflict. I went into the veterinary profession because I wanted to treat animals and look after animals, and I never thought, so this could be me, but it could be anybody just thinking this, your job is all about people. And I think that's that value conflict. The biggest challenge we have in the veterinary profession is expectation and reality, and there's a mismatch of that. A lot of the role is listening to people, building relationships with your clients, necessarily about the animal. Like, it would be lovely if it all was, but it's not. We're customer facing. It's a customer service industry, and we're at the whim of our clients, and that's not a bad thing. It's just that's the role we're in. That's what we do. So yeah.
Well, Ivan, there is the perception that in the consolidators, as you refer to them, that there seems to be more pressure on the team with regards to sales, especially those consolidators who have shareholders, listed on the stock exchange. So was that one of your considerations why you thought or your hypothesis was that vets in veterinary professionals working for the consolidators, after the ownership change, that there would be more burnout? Due to
that was the hypothesis. And again, I don't know if that almost ruined my dissertation because it wasn't that bright difference between them. I still think that there are many triggers that happen during the acquisition, and I listed all 6 of them. One way or the other are triggering, I think. It depends a lot on several factors in the groups. So what business model it is, or partnership model. If they acquire 100% and that's up front, and they expect someone to leave within the first year, then that's different from someone who wants to stay in the profession for another 10 years and work in a similar practice. They don't expect that this power change or disempowerment will happen. People think that I'm going to get paid, I'm going to keep my job, and I'm set for retirement. They don't know this little nuance of the fact that they're not going to feel that this team is the team that they built that they report to that person anymore. So there's a lot of things that actually happen, and we see statistically that a lot of veterinarians leave the practices after it's being acquired because of various things. And I don't want to say that consolidation of the industry is bad. There's definitely good in that, because you can consolidate the back office processes that veterinarians are terrible at. You can lower the cost of services because, again, you're consolidating the buying power and other things. But what I think is more important is not finding that it's their fault, but more finding that they, as a large management structure, can implement change that will actually alleviate these triggers. And that's what I'm kind of striving towards right now, is that it's not consolidation is worse than private practice. But if I go one practice to another, and Carolyne, and, you know, if we go to one to another practice, it's only one little change in one small practice. If consolidation can put in their strategy and the corporate social responsibility working against the triggers of burnout, I think we have a better chance of lowering the rates and of the suicide and the burnout. So that's, I think, what's more important, not whose fault it is, but how do we attack it?
Yeah. We can't blame them for what hasn't been done in the past. And so there's a lag, and there's an education that starts before we even get to university, and then what happens at university and how we're trained. And veterinary profession and veterinary practice is a business. We need to know how to run a business and what our role is as a veterinary surgeon in selling our service, because that's what we do. We sell our service. So we need to take all responsibility. We, like individuals, teams, practices, organizations, the profession, and do it at multiple levels at multiple times. And then we can work together on this. So, but I think that there is a lag. It's much more aware. 7 years ago, when I started doing this, it was just, people didn't know what coaching was. People didn't really have any value on non-clinical training, or very little value in non-clinical training. And there is much more now, but we're on a lag. It's going to take time.
Okay, well, we've the technical issues aside, we've got a few minutes left. So, Ivan, I'm going to come back to you, and now what I'd like to ask, from your personal perspective, you said earlier on that you suffered with burnout. So what was it that you then experienced?
So when I was preparing for this interview, I remember I actually was thinking about it, and I remember distinctly when I was sitting in the records, and the manager of the hospital was demanding some sort of a standard or some sort of SOP that I didn't, and her exact phrase was that it's almost like you don't care. Of course you do. And I turned around and said, I don't. And when you see that disengagement in people, when you see disengagement from their passion, which is care for animals, or when you see the cynicism coming through, especially in the emergency veterinarians, when you start becoming callous to the euthanasia because you do 10 a day, then you should pay attention to all of those symptoms, and the structure of the HR processes in the hospital, whether you're 1 or 1,000, should be very geared towards regular reviews, regular interviews, not adherence, but assessment whether the core values of the organization are the same core values that person has. In my personal, in one of the startups, we had one of the core values was sense of humor, and we do every 90 days. We rate ourselves and our employees. They rate themselves on 7 core values that they have. And if there's misalignment, we have a discussion, but sometimes that changes. And it was very interesting. I had one person that was just always kind of, having fun, jolly. We always have a sense of humor. Every organization I worked in, I just, I like working with people that have fun when they work. Yeah. And then this person was just not fun anymore. And I asked, and I said, look, you're always like, full of fun and everything is going well. And then now I just see that you're a little disengaged. And he said, well, my mom is really sick, and didn't want to share it, but that came out. So we were paying more attention to this. A lot of clinics don't do anything but treat patients, don't think about their employees. They don't do the regular reviews every 90 days. There's no structure to it. Because veterinarians don't have MBA. There's 2 vet schools in North America that include that in their curriculum, MBA and DVM. I think it's brilliant. But if you don't have that, your strategic plan with core values, mission, vision, quarterly reviews, they don't know anything about that. So that has to be implemented if you're running an organization, if you have people, and you need to implement those things to find the early signs of these conditions. I think that's very important.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think also it's really important to, because everybody's different and you'll have different signs, don't ever assume or presume. And that's where the one-on-ones, the check-ins are so important. We use a cultural temperature check that we've got, that we use, practices can use it, and it literally looks at the demands, control, support, roles, relationships, how much change has been going on, and it feeds it back as a traffic light. So red, like there's a big problem; yellow, keep an eye on this; green, this is great, or this is working well at the moment. So again, having that as an anonymous survey. So what feedback are you getting from your team? Don't assume you know what they're thinking, and that can be a really good tool to temperature check, to then start the conversations. And again, bring it onto the table, have those open on those conversations. The most recent survey we've done, this has become an issue. This could be a questionnaire anomaly, or what's behind this? So let's talk about it. Is it something we can remove because it just doesn't need to be a risk to our health and a way how we work? Or do we need to find a structural fit and a fix, because we need to reduce the impact it's having on us? We can't change COVID. We can't change what clients do. We can't change quite a lot of stuff, but there's quite a lot of stuff that we can at least influence. So having those temperature checks are really important. Don't ever assume, don't ever presume, but ask. And then you can work with that.
This has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much. Very interesting. And before we say goodbye, well, firstly, I will in the show notes have links to your LinkedIn pages, Ivan, your research, and where you can be found. So we will do that. But I was wondering, Ivan, now you'll tell us about your podcast soon, I'm sure, but usually at the end of your podcast, and I was a guest on yours a few months ago, you ask about a book that your guests could recommend. So today I'm going to return the favor, and I'm going to ask both of you if there's a book that you could recommend to the regular GuavaVet viewers.
So I recently read a book, and it's actually just came out in December. It is available on I think Amazon and Kindle, and coming in a hard copy as well. The author, I'm gonna butcher her name, but she's lovely. So Neha Tanea, I think. She has an extensive experience as the practice manager, veterinary technician, or nurse. She holds a business degree, and she combined all her knowledge and experience in a book called A Paw Partnership. And it talks about the experience through the lens of someone who had a dream to work in the veterinary domain, and then was hit with all the struggles of euthanasias and client frustrations and everything else. It's a very well written book, so I definitely recommend it. So it's called A Paw Partnership, and it's by Neha Tanea.
Carolyne.
I'm going to come back to oldie but a goodie, and it's Simon Sinek, Start With Your Why. We're talking about core values, value conflict, know your purpose, know your why, because that will help you navigate through all the challenges and get really back to the core of why am I doing what I'm doing? And your why is so important. It will help you in so many things. So that for me is a go-to goodie but oldie but goodie.
Well, I will most certainly put that in the show notes, and I'm going to recommend a book as well today, and that is also an oldie, and it's Daniel Pink's To Sell is Human, because I honestly think that if there's one thing that we veterinarians lack, is to understand sales. Thank you so much. All the links will be in the show notes. Thank you so much for your time. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye.